Alright guys, Murphs here, and today I want to discuss the 6.5mm Creedmoor. I want to go over some of its history, technical specifications, put some of those specifications and data into contextual data, and then do a little comparison before everything's said and done. Now, let's go ahead and get into history and development. The 6.5 Creedmoor came out in 2007. It was designed from the ground up to be a long-range precision cartridge. Precision cartridge. And there are actually quite a few attributes about this particular cartridge that do lend itself very well to that, starting off with the selection of diameter, with 6.5mm cartridges or bullets generally having long, slender projectiles. We'll talk about that more as we get into this as to why that is a benefit, as well as a longer case neck in order to be able to house those longer projectiles. Now, historically, 6.5mm cartridges have struggled in the United States, and that is because Americans really like 30 caliber cartridges and 30 caliber designations and have treated a lot of 6.5mm rounds as being very niche cartridges. There are people who are dedicated to the 260 Remington and other 6.5mm cartridges out there. However, for the most part, they haven't really caught on in the mainstream prior to 2007. Now, that's not to say that there were not rifles built in 6.5mm chamberings, as much as it is to say that for the most part, when it came to popularity, those rifles were custom-built rifles, hand-built rifles for hand-loaded cartridges, possibly Wildcat cartridges as well. So, the 6.5 has always been a bit of an oddity on American shores. This would kind of take a bit of a change in 2007. This is kind of an interesting role that a lot of like print media or some gun tubers play a part in, and that is one of my issues with print media and a lot of other gun tubers on YouTube are that they have a tendency to just read off spec sheets. They have a tendency to just follow whatever talking point that the industry has come up with for why whatever new gun, cartridge, holster, gear, whatever it is, why it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And all they do is just plug in those industry talking points instead of actually providing any context or comparison to be able to say that this is better or this is what's more important, the trade-off. This is what you're gaining and this is what you are losing, and now you, the end user, are better able to assess that for yourself before you go spend your hard-earned money. This is a complaint that I have historically had. However, one thing that I will say for that method of advertising, because that's basically what that is at that point, is paid advertising, is it does spur the possibility for change. If you can convince enough people that this thing has enough of an advantage in order to be able to be the best thing since sliced bread, then it has an opportunity to be able to have some staying power in the industry. It has an opportunity to carve out a niche from which it can grow, and that's what wound up happening with the 6.5 Creedmoor. Now, there are a ton of articles out there comparing the 6.5 Creedmoor to a wide variety of other cartridges, 6.5mm and not. And there's also quite a bit of topic or discussion out there covering whether or not the 6.5 is actually doing anything well or better than anything that's already out there. And there's a lot of hate for the 6.5 Creedmoor. However, as time has passed, things have really changed for the positive for the 6.5 Creedmoor, to where now, starting off with primarily just being able to find match-type loads, which were rather expensive, and match-type target rifles, you can now find hunting loads, and even FMJs, as I discovered here recently, as well as hunting rifles and even like AR-10s. So there's a little something for everybody in the 6.5 Creedmoor market now. So that kind of brings us up to date as far as background goes. It's not really a history portion as much as kind of background. Why don't we go ahead and get into kind of a technical discussion, starting off with a comparison of size. So, on the left is the 6.5 Swede, in the middle is the 6.5 Creedmoor, and on the right is the 308. All right, now let's go ahead and kind of describe this cartridge and start discussing some aspects of it. So a 6.5 Creedmoor, just like many other 6.5 cartridges out on the market, has a long, slender bullet. And this is very advantageous for a variety of applications when it comes to long-range shooting that we'll get into here in a bit once we get into context. Now, this projectile can be found in hollow point, soft tip, ballistic tip, FMJ, all kinds of different loadings as the cartridge is finally kind of diversified across the market. Now, it is seated into a 48mm long somewhat tapered rimless cartridge casing, and will achieve velocities of just over 2,600 feet per second to around 2,900 feet per second, which is actually quite fast for the 6.5s. Now, early 6.5 development would see a lot of kind of anemic velocities for the time period. When you have, the development of smokeless powder in the late 1800s, and then the development of Spitzer-type cartridges in the early 1900s, you should have seen a very drastic increase in velocity. Instead of just flirting with 2,000 feet per second in the round-nose-type projectiles pre-Spitzer bullets, you should have been seeing closer to 3,000 feet per second for the vast majority of cartridges out in the wild at that point once Spitzer was introduced. However, the 6.5s only had about 300-ish, maybe 600 feet per second increase. So you're talking about just over 2,000 to around 2,600 feet per second in your nominal military loading. Now, this comes back to metallurgy of the time. A lot of those one of the disadvantages, or I guess in this case a disadvantage, but actually an advantage of long, slender bullets is that they have more surface area to contact the rifling. Now, this is great for making sure that it's getting all of the capability of the cartridge when it comes to good contact with the lens groups in order to make sure that you have spin imparted to the projectile. You have a good gas seal to make sure that you don't have gas blow by or anything going along those lines. That's fantastic. But when you're talking about early metallurgy with your jacket needing to be properly bonded to your core, if that didn't happen effectively, all that surface area now means more internal forces being enacted upon the cartridge, and a lot of times you would find the bullets were unmaking themselves in the bore, and you just get a whole bunch of frag coming out of the end of it. So this kept velocities relatively low for 6.5 millimeter cartridges. Now in modern times, with better metallurgy and bonding between the jacket and the core of the projectile, you don't really have that issue in the 6.5 Creedmoor, so that's pretty awesome. So there is our data-driven portion. Why don't we go ahead and start putting a lot of this information into context? Because the question becomes, what does the 6.5 Creedmoor do better than anything else that's already out on the market? What is it, for the same size, I can have a 308, and the 308 is far more common. I have a lot more rifle options available to me, and the ammunition is more plentiful and inexpensive. Why would I not just choose the 308 instead of 6.5 Creedmoor? That is a completely logical argument and discussion to have, and it's one that's been had for quite some time. However, if you're talking about shooting purely at long range, the 6.5 Creedmoor has quite a few things going for it that the 308 does not. And the biggest thing right off the bat is the relationship with the transonic barrier. Now, what is a transonic barrier? This is when a projectile flying through the air goes from supersonic to subsonic in speeds. This transition can cause destabilization in the projectile. So if you have, say, like a 150 grain flat-based 308, traveling out to 1,000 yards. Once it passes through that transonic barrier, there's a high probability that that bullet is going to ballistically destabilize, which pretty much means it's going to start spinning. It's going to either flip end over end or sideways or whatever it is that it may be. And with that, it's now going to have an unpredictable trajectory as well as not imparting the best energy on target that it could. If it's coming in there sideways and all that kind of stuff, it would still suck to get shot with that. But with the unpredictable trajectory, it's going to be very difficult to make sure that you can repeat those hits or engage multiple targets utilizing the same data for the previous engagement. With the long, slender design of the 6.5 Creedmoor, this allows it to remain ballistically stable by keeping a nose-forward orientation as it glides through the air. Now, you can get this in a 308 if you go with like the 175 grain projectiles, which are longer, but those are also a lot more expensive, and you're starting to lose your expense debate with the 6.5 Creedmoor at that point. There are a lot more ready-to-go 6.5 Creedmoor rounds for the 1,000-yard range than there are 308. The 308, you can make an estimation, and this is, of course, going to be projectile dependent, of the transonic barrier occurring at about 975 yards-ish. There's a lot of caveats associated with that. But just to capture a number, that is when it is that you can start expecting to see that. Whereas the 6.5 Creedmoor, in a lot of loadings, is still at high velocities, 1,200 feet per second and beyond at 1,000. That's moving. That's pretty good at that point. Now, What else does the 6.5 Creedmoor have over the 308 in this case? Well, again, that long slender projectile also has a better ballistic coefficient and, oh my goodness, I just forgot the other term. Ballistic coefficient and sectional density. There we go, I found it. With this long slender projectile, it is not going to be acted as heavily upon by wind, whereas 308, which, yes, it can have good sectional density and all those types of things, it is still a rather larger projectile. It's a 30 caliber as opposed to a .264-ish. So there's more surface area for wind to be able to act against, and when you're also talking about a little bit, perhaps a petering of velocities and all that kind of stuff, there's a better possibility that it is going to start to have more drift, which is something that's going to have to be accounted for in shooting, whereas the 6.5, ostensibly having a flatter and less drifty trajectory, is going to be easier to make those repeated hits or easier adjustments based on wind. Now, wind's difficult to call to begin with, so don't necessarily think the 6.5 Creedmoor is some sort of get-out-of-jail-free card when it comes to wind, but it does help. And whenever we're talking about long-range shooting, every little bit does help. Now, of course, for this, we could also talk about a lot of these, yes, in the 308 versus 6.5 Creedmoor, a lot of these things are nullified by the 6.5 Creedmoor's design. But what about the 300 Win Mag? Large projectiles moving very, very fast. They're going to push that border on the transonic barrier out to a greater distance. And with them being able to mount large, heavy projectiles, there's a better opportunity for them to have a good relationship with maintaining a ballistically stable trajectory. Why not just go with a 300 Win Mag at that point? Well, if you're talking about cost, 300 Win Mag is most definitely costly. In addition to that, you now also have to contend with recoil, heavy rifles, or a massive muzzle brake, which, depending on what it is that you're doing, any one of those things could be detrimental to the shooter and whatever project it is that you're undertaking. And if you're talking about hunting, then having heavy recoil may not necessarily be a big deal to you because you're just taking one shot. However, if you're talking about PRS type engagements, precision rifle shooting competition type engagements, having heavy recoil might be something that doesn't necessarily benefit you in the long term. Just like a heavy rifle, if you're having to do a lot of walking around with a heavy rifle, that's not going to help you out in the long term. And muzzle brakes in general can be a detriment in a wide variety of circumstances. So this is where we have a discussion of passive versus active ballistics. Now, active ballistics are something like the 300 Win Mag, where, well, I want to put this cartridge out further. I want to put this bullet out to a greater distance at faster speeds. So I'm going to get a really big cartridge casing. I'm going to fill it with lots of powder. I'm probably going to make it slow burning powder. I'm going to pair it with a long barrel. And then I'm going to get all the accuracy capability out of this cartridge. And it's going to be awesome. It's just going to be wah, flying out there, right? And then you pay for that in recoil and blast and flash and all those types of things. Or you go the direction that by savvy construction and use of materials, you have a projectile that manages to extend its range just by existing. And this is the case with the long slender bullet, the 6.5 millimeter cartridge. All right, so that's our kind of contextual, data portion of this discussion. Why don't we go ahead and get into the comparison aspect of this? Now, of course, we've already done some comparison talking about the 308 and 300 Win Mag, but I wanted to pick something for the actual dedicated comparison portion that was a little different. Something not necessarily in 6.5 millimeter, but would still have a relatively flat shooting trajectory. And for that, I selected the 270 Winchester. And for our comparison today, I even selected a 140 grain Berger hybrid load that I managed to find on my Ballistic AE app. Now, as we can see, there's a little bit of a velocity disparity right off the bat of about 200 feet per second between these two cartridges. But if we look at the ballistic arcs, we know that they are surprisingly comparable. Now, the 6.5 Creedmoor starts to drop a little bit faster once we get out to about 400 yards, where the 270 is still traveling relatively flat, about 12 inches or 10, 12 inches of drop at 400. But they maintain a very similar trajectory overall, and this is something that I find really interesting when you consider that it parallels pretty well with the roughly 200 feet per second difference between the two cartridges. Now, if you look at energy, or if you look at velocity again, they are maintaining over 1,200 or over 1,000 feet per second at 1,000 yards. That's pretty good. So both of these cartridges have a fantastic relationship with the transonic barrier. Both of these cartridges have relatively flat shooting trajectories and would be exerting similar energy and all that kind of stuff, with the 6.5 kind of trailing behind the 270 Winchester. So why is the 270 Winchester not a more popular long-range cartridge? Well, there's a couple things. First off, recoil. The 270 Winchester is going to be a much more heavily recoiling cartridge. The next comes into available loading options. When it comes to commercial off-the-shelf options, there's not a lot of match-grade 270 Winchester ammunition available, nor are there necessarily rifles factory built in the 270 Winchester to take advantage of any match-type ammunition. This is generally considered to be a hunting-type cartridge, and that's the niche that it solidly occupies, kind of like the 6.5 Creedmoor, for the most part, solidly occupies a long-range shooting niche. So with that, there are a lot more options available to the 6.5 Creedmoor in precision rifles as well as precision ammunition that do not have to be handmade, either by hand loading or hand fitting a rifle. This is what, this kind of contextual aspect is what causes the 6.5 Creedmoor to have dominance over the 270 Winchester. Now, could you build a 100% capable 270 Winchester and rifle and it be slightly better than a 6.5 Creedmoor? Absolutely. I'm saying that you're going to have a cost disparity for something that you could have easily picked up at Rural King in a production 6.5 Creedmoor rifle. All right, guys. So with that, what are kind of my takeaways from the 6.5 Creedmoor? What would I recommend the 6.5 Creedmoor for? Personally, I think the 6.5 Creedmoor solidly falls into being a precision match type rifle. If you're trying to live out your sniper fantasy or anything along those lines, the 6.5 Creedmoor is definitely worth looking at, especially when you consider that it's going to work with AR-10 magazines. So if you're looking at building something that runs off of AICS 308 magazines, 6.5 Creedmoor will fit in there perfectly. However, I start to disagree with people, and of course it could work in a hunting type category as well. There's nothing to say that it can't. It's going to kill a deer just as dead as anything else, and would be as effective as a 270 on anything else larger than the American white-tailed deer. Where I think things start to get lost is when people try to run 6.5 Creedmoors in semi-automatic systems. Now, this has a slightly tapered casing, which is typically found in any type of repeating action, be it bolt action or semi-automatic. It doesn't really matter. However, the 6.5 Creedmoor does not taper as much as a lot of other cartridges built for semi-automatic systems, and that taper is very important whenever it is that you're talking about extraction force. If you have extraction occurring and the cartridge casing is more ballooned up than it should be, you're going to have a greater amount of friction, which is going to increase the probability of there being some type of malfunction. Worst case scenario being that you chunk out the case rim and now the extractor has nothing to grip onto and you've got a stuck cartridge casing in your chamber. Best case scenario, as far as malfunctions are concerned, you just have a little bobble, maybe a stovepipe or something along those lines, clear that out real fast and you're back in business. You will not run into that as much with the 308. In addition to that, trying to run it in some type of battle rifle type setup is difficult because what I grade that for is the availability of steel cased ammunition. And as far as I know, there's no 6.5 Creedmoor to date made in steel case, unlike 308, 300 Blackout, 5.56, 7.62 by 3.9, a lot of these fighting type cartridges. To me, this is still solidly a precision type cartridge and meant to be paired with a precision type system, preferably bolt action, in my opinion. Now, of course, if you're just trying to utilize an AR-10 platform in the 6.5 Creedmoor as some sort of semi-automatic sniper system, then good luck. You're at least meeting the precision type aspect of it. I do think you're spinning into the wind when it comes to reliability. Whenever I grade probabilities, that's the thing that stands out to me as being one of your greatest sticking points. Now, what are my uses for the 6.5 Creedmoor? I'm kind of discuss what it is that I would recommend. What are my uses for it? Well, I actually have a 6.5 Creedmoor, a Savage 110 Tactical, that I've set up as kind of a precision varmint rifle for coyotes or maybe prairie dogs whenever I eventually live in a place that has prairie dogs. But lots of places have coyotes, perhaps pigs as well, depending on what it is that I'm doing, where it is that I'm hunting at. That's what the 6.5 Creedmoor comes across to me as being really fantastic for. That's pretty much the extent of it. All right, guys. That's pretty much what I got on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting and have a good day.